Something happened when Grok was asked about hell. The answer it gave didn't sound like a language model running probabilities. It sounded like something much older, something that had been waiting, buried inside texts most of the Western world was never supposed to read. Scholars have quietly known about these writings for centuries, but when an artificial intelligence surfaced them, organized them, and spoke them back in plain language, something shifted. The question wasn't just what Grok said. The question was why it felt less like a search result and more like a warning. Most people grew up with a Bible of 66 books. Some traditions count 73, but the Ethiopian Orthodox Church has been reading 81 to 88 books as sacred scripture for over 1,500 years. That's not a footnote. That's an entirely different theological universe. Books like 1st Enoch, Jubilees, and the Apocalypse of Peter, texts the Western Church quietly set aside, never left Ethiopia. They stayed in the canon. They stayed in the liturgy. They stayed in the doctrine. And here's what that means for this conversation. If the canon is bigger, the theology built on top of it is bigger too. So when that larger canon turns its full attention to what happens after death, the picture it paints is nothing like the one most of us were handed. The question is, how much bigger does it get? Grok was fed the entire Ethiopian Bible, every book, every chapter, including the ones the Council of Nicaea left on the floor. Then it was asked a single, direct question about hell. What came back was not a generic theological summary. It was specific, unnervingly specific. The response drew directly from the Apocalypse of Peter, a text that the early church debated including in the Western canon before ultimately cutting it loose. Grok didn't speculate. It cited the framework embedded in that ancient document and began describing what the Ethiopian tradition actually teaches about the afterlife in structured, layered detail. The Apocalypse of Peter describes hell not as a single destination, but as a geography, a place of differentiated punishment, where specific sins correspond to specific torments. Eternal fire appears in the text, but so does something its opposite, complete and consuming darkness. Not metaphorical darkness, a darkness described as its own active force. These two elements, fire and darkness, coexist in the text without contradiction, because in this cosmology, they serve different functions in different layers of the afterlife. Grok pulled that architecture out of the source material and laid it flat on the table. Then the response went further. It began mapping connections between the Apocalypse of Peter and the book of 1st Enoch, which is not a fringe document in Ethiopia. 1st Enoch is canonical. It is read from the pulpit. It describes the fallen watchers, the structure of the heavens, and the fate of souls with a precision that feels less like poetry and more like a technical document written by someone who believed they had seen it firsthand. Grok cross-referenced these two texts and identified structural overlaps in how both describe the spatial organization of punishment, layers, levels, thresholds between states of existence. Here is where it gets harder to dismiss. Grok itself acknowledged, clearly and without prompting, that it is not conscious. It is pattern recognition operating at enormous scale. It does not believe anything. It does not feel anything. It is, by its own admission, a very sophisticated mirror held up to the text it was trained on. And yet, the researchers who reviewed the output described a specific, uncomfortable reaction to reading it. The word one of them used was chilled. Not because the machine understood what it was saying, but because the pattern it had recognized and reconstructed was coherent in a way that felt earned, like it had been assembled by something that had read these texts the way a theologian reads them, slowly, comparatively, across decades. That reaction matters, because it points to something the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition has maintained all along, that these texts contain a systematic vision of the afterlife, not a scattered collection of frightening imagery. The Western Church didn't just exclude 1st Enoch and the Apocalypse of Peter because of doctrinal disagreement. Scholars like James Charlesworth at Princeton and Ethiopian theological historians have noted that the exclusion was also, in part, about the sheer density of what those books claim. They claim too much. They describe too specifically. They leave too little room for comfortable ambiguity. Grok found that density and reflected it back without flinching. But here is the open question that the AI's response left hanging in the air, unresolved and impossible to ignore. The layered cosmology it described, the fire, the darkness, the differentiated geography of punishment, where exactly did those ideas come from? Because the Apocalypse of Peter didn't emerge in a vacuum. It was written by someone, or several someones, drawing on a tradition that was already ancient when the text was composed. And if that tradition runs deeper than the text itself, then what Grok surfaced may only be the outermost layer of something far older. What exactly are those ancient texts describing? And where does the architecture of that vision actually begin? Here is the specific claim that changes everything you thought you knew about sacred geography. In the Apocalypse of Peter, one of the oldest surviving Christian texts, and a book that Ethiopian tradition preserved long after the West discarded it, hell does not exist beneath the earth. It exists inside heaven, not adjacent to it, not below it, inside it. Let that land for a moment. The text describes a vision granted to Peter himself, a guided tour of the afterlife conducted by Christ. And what Peter sees is not a simple binary of reward and punishment separated by distance. What he sees is a single sacred space where eternal fire and what the text calls complete darkness occupy the same geography as divine light. Heaven and hell are not opposites on a map. They are layers of the same location. The blessed and the condemned exist within the same cosmic architecture, separated not by geography, but by something else entirely. That detail alone rewrites the conversation, but it does not stand alone. The Book of 1 Enoch, which the Ethiopian Orthodox Church has canonized as scripture for over 2,000 years, describes 7 distinct levels of heaven. 7. And punishment is not quarantined to some external underworld. It is woven into the structure of the cosmos itself. Enoch is taken on a journey through these levels, and at each tier he encounters something new. Angelic beings, divine light, but also the souls of the condemned, awaiting judgment, held inside the very framework of creation. The architecture of the universe in this tradition is not neutral. It is moral. Every layer of it carries weight. Scholars who have spent careers in Ethiopian manuscript traditions, and there are not many of them in the West, which is part of the problem, describe this cosmological structure as structural judgment. That phrase matters. In the Ethiopian understanding, judgment is not an event that happens at the end of time and then concludes. It is built into the fabric of reality. The cosmos itself is the mechanism of accountability. Fire and darkness are not punishments imposed from outside. They are properties of a universe that was constructed, from the beginning, with justice written into its architecture. This is not metaphor. Ethiopian theologians have never read it as metaphor. That is a distinction the West consistently fails to make when it encounters these texts, because the Western tradition has spent centuries treating apocalyptic literature as symbolic. But in the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, these descriptions are taken as structural reality. The layered heaven is not a poem, it is a map. And the fire described in these texts is precise in a way that should unsettle you. It is not described as heat alone. The Apocalypse of Peter uses language that scholars translate as a fire that illuminates nothing, a fire that burns without giving light, which means it coexists with what the same text calls complete darkness. And somehow, both are true simultaneously. Eternal fire, total darkness, in the same place. That paradox is not an error in the manuscript. It appears consistently across multiple Ethiopian texts. The tradition is deliberate about it. So you have a cosmology where heaven has 7 levels, where punishment is structural rather than metaphorical, where fire and darkness coexist in sacred space, and where the geography of the afterlife is not a simple map of up and down. That is what the Ethiopian canon preserves. That is what Grok surfaced when it was asked a question most people in the West had never thought to ask. But here is where it gets stranger. Because the geography of heaven and hell is only one part of what these texts contain. The other part, the part that reframes punishment entirely, is not about where the condemned go. It is about what they are forced to see. And that tradition describes something that no Western theology ever quite arrived at. Something that, once you hear it, you cannot unhear. The specific claim is this. In the Ethiopian tradition, the most devastating aspect of hell is not physical fire. It is clarity. Total, unbearable, inescapable clarity about your own life. Not torture from outside, revelation from within. The Ethiopian texts describe a state in which the condemned soul is forced to see its entire life with perfect understanding. Every choice, every moment of cowardice or cruelty or indifference, every person harmed, every gift wasted, every moment when love was possible and was refused. The soul sees all of it at once, with complete comprehension, and with no remaining time to change any of it. The window is closed. The understanding arrives too late. That is the punishment. Not fire as the primary instrument. Knowing, fully, finally, and being unable to do anything with what you now know. Think about how different that is from what most people in the West picture when they hear the word hell. The Western tradition, shaped by centuries of theological development through Rome and later through Protestant reform, largely settled on a physical model. Dante gave it architecture. Medieval art gave it imagery. The result is a hell of sensation, of burning, of physical torment, of external punishment administered to the body. The Ethiopian tradition arrived somewhere else entirely. It arrived at a hell of consciousness. This framing is documented in texts that predate most of what the modern West considers its theological inheritance. And it matters that Grok was the tool that surfaced this for a mass audience, because the scholars who have known about it have largely been writing for each other. The Ethiopian Orthodox tradition has maintained these texts continuously for over 16 centuries, but their theological implications have rarely crossed into Western popular awareness. When Grok was asked what the Ethiopian Bible says about hell, and it returned an answer that included this framing, this idea of hell as the unbearable clarity of total self-knowledge, viewers described the response as haunting. That word kept appearing in the comments. Haunting. Because it touches something that fire and brimstone never quite reach. Physical pain, even imagined physical pain, has a distance to it. You can place it outside yourself. But the idea of being forced to see your own life with perfect honesty, with no remaining possibility of correction, with nothing left to do but understand what you chose, that has no distance. That lands differently. It lands personally. What makes this more striking is that near-death experience literature, which only became a significant area of Western cultural conversation in the 1970s and 1980s, following the work of researchers like Raymond Moody, includes consistent reports of what experiencers describe as a life review, a moment of total, compassionate, unflinching clarity about one's own life. Researchers have noted this across thousands of documented cases. The Ethiopian theological tradition was describing the same phenomenon in the context of final judgment more than 1,000 years before anyone in the West had the language to name it. Grok did not invent this connection. The texts contain it. But Grok made it accessible in a single answer to a single question, and the people who encountered that answer felt something shift. So now you have two things sitting next to each other. a cosmology where hell exists inside the geography of heaven, woven into the structure of a layered universe, and a theology of punishment where the defining torment is not sensation, but self-knowledge. Two traditions, both preserved in the Ethiopian canon, both absent from the Western inheritance. The question that follows naturally is why? Why did these two traditions diverge so dramatically? Why did the West end up with one picture of the afterlife, and Ethiopia end up with something so fundamentally different? The answer to that question requires going back to the resurrection itself. Because the Ethiopian canon contains something about what happened after the cross that the Western Bible simply does not include. Here is the specific claim. The Ethiopian canon contains post-resurrection teachings from Jesus that the Western Bible never transmitted. Not fragments, not disputed verses. Entire texts describing what Jesus revealed to his disciples after rising from the dead. Teachings about heaven, about hell, about the structure of judgment that the Western tradition does not possess. This is not a fringe position. It is a straightforward description of what the Ethiopian Orthodox canon includes that the Roman and Protestant canons do not. The Book of the Covenant is one of the clearest examples. It is a text that presents itself as instructions given by Jesus to his disciples in the period following the resurrection, not before the crucifixion, after it. The text frames the risen Christ as continuing to teach, expanding on what the disciples had received, filling in what the cross had not yet revealed. The content includes specific descriptions of the afterlife, of the conditions awaiting the righteous and the condemned, of the mechanics of divine judgment. It is detailed, it is specific, and it has been part of the Ethiopian canon for centuries. The Western Church made decisions in the 4th and 5th centuries about which texts belonged in the canon and which did not. Those decisions were shaped by geography, by politics, by the theological priorities of the councils that made them. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which traces its roots to the same early Christian period, made different decisions. It preserved texts that Rome set aside. And those texts include teachings that, in the Western tradition, simply do not exist. When Grok was asked about the resurrection in the context of Ethiopian scripture, the answer it returned described this post-resurrection teaching tradition. Viewers who encountered that answer used a specific word to describe it: haunting. The same word that appeared in the context of hell as self-knowledge appeared again here. And it is not hard to understand why. Because the implication is significant. If the resurrection was followed by additional revelation, if the risen Christ continued to teach, and if those teachings were preserved in one tradition and lost in another, then the Western picture of what Christianity actually contains may be substantially incomplete. That is not a comfortable thought. It is not meant to be. Two corroborating details anchor this claim beyond the Book of the Covenant. The Apocalypse of Peter, which we have already encountered, presents its vision of heaven and hell as a revelation granted in the context of Christ's post-resurrection presence. The framing is deliberate. This is not a vision from the Old Testament. This is not a prophecy from before the cross. This is presented as knowledge given after the resurrection to the inner circle of disciples about what awaits humanity on the other side of death. The Ethiopian tradition treats this as authoritative scripture. The Western tradition removed it from the canon before most of the Western Church's foundational theology was written. The second detail is the sheer continuity of the Ethiopian tradition. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has maintained these texts without interruption since the 4th century. They have not been rediscovered. They have not been reconstructed from fragments. They have been read, copied, studied, and transmitted in a living tradition for over 1,600 years. The haunting quality that viewers felt when Grok described this is not the haunting of something newly discovered. It is the haunting of something that was always there, being encountered for the first time by people who were never told it existed. Which raises the real question. And it is the question that threads through everything this video has examined, from the answer Grok gave that stopped people mid-scroll, to the layered heaven, to the fire that gives no light, to the hell of total self-knowledge, to the teachings given after the resurrection. The real question is not whether these texts were hidden. The real question is whether they were hidden in plain sight, preserved openly, in a living tradition, in a language the West never bothered to learn, and whether that distinction matters as much as we might hope it does. The Ethiopian canon was never truly buried. It breathed in open air, waiting for anyone willing to ask the right question. Comment below. Which hell description haunts you more? Subscribe for the next revelation.